This is Tech Talk Detroit with Brian Spurgeon and Chuck Lobert. Tech Talk Detroit brings you the latest in tech news and Detroit happenings every week.
Welcome back to Tech Talk Detroit. We're happy to have you with us again this week. And we thought what we would talk about this week is around projects. You know, how the proper way to plan a project, what you should expect from your internal team. How do you know when you need to reach out to for external help from another IT provider, and then really what you should expect from that outside IT provider to know that you're working with somebody who can handle the project and who's going to be a good resource for you. So first of all, Brian, welcome. How you doing today?
I'm doing good, Chuck. How about you?
I can't complain. Weather's nice. I'm hoping to get out there and enjoy the outside a bit today, so I can't complain too much.
I know, yeah, especially coming off of the October front that was this past weekend. You know, it's nice to get back in the 70s and 80s and sunny. So,
for sure.
Yeah. Speaking of projects, though, I'm in the process of redoing the paver stone patio in the back, power washing it, and putting the new sand in. So, very cool. It's crazy what a difference it makes.
Assessment?
Of course I did. Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I might also have to do a change control for some additional sand. I might have underestimated how much it needs. So
yeah.
It's just like anything, right? What's a home project if you don't have to make, 4 or 5 trips to the hardware store? So
spend 5 times what you were expecting to.
Exactly. So on that note, yeah, I think it's a good topic for today. You know, in the business world, it's a lot easier to not have to do that, right? That's the goal, is to get this all right in one swoop. So I think, we have a very good process in terms of how we go about treating projects, both in terms of planning and then execution. And then also, I think very important to analyze when projects are all said and done and figure out where you can improve next time. So I think ultimately, that's kind of how we can go through this, is to kind of shed light in terms of how our process goes, how we drive these projects. I think a lot of times when businesses work with, companies like us, where you're kind of outsourcing a portion of your IT, you're in the dark in a lot of in terms of what goes into a successful project. So I think it's a good opportunity to both understand, when you're working with a company like ours, how we work, and then also, if you're a company listening that, you have your own internal IT, you can probably get some tidbits of this, especially if you have an upcoming initiative you want to drive.
Yeah, so why don't we start there? When we look at somebody that's got their own internal IT team, they're not working with an outsourced provider, what should they be looking at when it comes to their external team? Let's say, it's time to move to the cloud, it's time to put in some kind of a new security initiative, or it's time to replace your infrastructure, whatever it is. Where does every project start? I guess is probably the best way to phrase it. And obviously with us, and we would recommend this for anybody, it always starts with an assessment. And
Exactly.
from your opinion, your experience, why is that so important?
Well, I think for one, you have to understand what your objective is by accomplishing this project. So whether it's to address inefficiency, whether it's addressing end of life hardware, software, or if you want to make a move to getting rid of your on-prem infrastructure and make a move to the cloud, you have to have a goal of what you're trying to accomplish. So I think the first step is the assessment. Then is to do your data collection, right? You got to understand where you're at today. You got to and in the process of that, I think our assessment process really includes, it's beyond data collection. It's also a very thorough interview with our client when we do it. So I think from if you're a company that's looking to do this with your own IT department, that interview process is really with the decision makers, obviously, and then also the department heads. So I think there's kind of a twofold approach. So you want to understand, we're always trying to scope a project to make sure that this is something that's going to accommodate next 5 years, right? So we want to make sure that the plan that we bring forward will for sure accommodate any growth plans you have, both from whether it's, just simply adding more users, a second location, or even just data, right? Looking at, your trajectory in terms of how your data grows. We want to make sure we're accommodating all that. So that way, it's not every couple of years now you got to invest more money into your hardware. We want to get that all up front. I think also too, in order to properly design the solution, you got to have input from all of the people that it affects. So that's where I think it's good to include all the department heads that would be impacted by it to understand where they're at, because a lot of times when you start to get in these business level discussions, that these aren't, when you're talking about moving to a new system, it's not something that's part of your day-to-day talk. You're going to find a lot of other opportunities to improve the workplace, the workflows, and efficiencies for the company as a whole. You're going to see that there's a good opportunity to get a lot of gaps addressed during this process. So I think, yeah, it has to start with that assessment phase. And to me, it's two-part. It's where are we at today? Where do we want to go? And let's get the input of everybody involved of what we could do to help improve them and roll that into this. And then the second piece is obviously, here's all the data collection that we have. And also here's how our trends have been in the past 3 to 4 years, right? The last time we did a server project, we thought we needed this amount of resources. We didn't even make it 3 years and we had to add to that, right? So you want to take into that in consideration, because you don't want to make that same mistake. You want to learn this next time around. I think that's the first step.
Yeah, and I think it's important to do that no matter how well you think you know your system and the plan that you're putting into place, because you always, no matter what, you want to start with that assessment, just even if it's just to make sure, because you want to make sure that you know exactly what pieces of software are going to be affected. You want to talk to the manufacturers of that software to make sure, if you're going to go, let's say you're going from 2016 to 2019, or you're going to move to the cloud, is that software going to be supported in that environment? Different things like that. And then, I think it's important too that you touched on, setting up that meeting and talking to each department head, because even if you think it's something that's not going to really impact a particular department, it's very rare that any kind of a project doesn't have some kind of an impact on everybody in an organization. So even if it's just so that they know what's going on and what to expect, that's a good thing. But also, to get from them what their plans are, their 5-year goals are, because you might talk to one department and they might say, well, we're going to grow by 10%. And then you might talk to another department, and that particular department might have some big thing coming up that somebody else didn't know about. And maybe they're going to add 50 people. It's really important to get the whole company involved so that you have that holistic view of how this is going to impact the company and what benefits it could bring, what challenges it could bring. So you can think all of that through ahead of time, talk to the different software providers, that type of stuff ahead of time, so that there's less surprises, at the time that you go to implement. So I think that's super important.
That's totally it. And you kind of hit on something there too. It helps to get the buy-in of everybody in the company. And anytime that you involve the company, you're going to get a much smoother approach in terms of how that goes. Anytime when you're talking about technology, the general workforce typically is not too receptive to major changes, right? Especially when they seemingly come out of nowhere. And I think anytime you have an opportunity, even just sending a survey to your team, and just getting feedback, you might get something good out of there that you can use that you weren't thinking of. But it gives the impression that you're involving the entire company in a major business decision. So I think that is a huge benefit.
Yeah, that's for every project that we do, we put, I don't know, probably 40 plus hours into that assessment phase, and coupling that up with that design phase. So you can see that there's a lot of work that's happening in the background, and that should be happening, whether it's outsourced or being handled internally. So once you get that assessment phase done, you go through all of that data, the next spot that you're going to go to really is starting to move towards that design phase, right? So, why don't we talk about that a little bit and what that design phase should look like? What, again, once you're done with that design, now what do you do? Who else do you talk with at that point to explain what's going to be happening, and all of that kind of stuff. So when we look at the design phase now, we've got the assessment done, we've put together the the data from that assessment, the data from all of the interviews we did. Now we're going to move into designing the actual solution, the change that's going to happen. So, what does that process start to look like at that point?
Yeah, so I think for us, typically it's a 2 to 3 step internal phase in terms of just handoffs and involvement for us to get through and complete a successful design. So I think it starts with, the engineers that are doing the assessment. They'll typically get together and they'll start to brainstorm their ideas, right? Because now at this point, they know what the objective is, the end game of what the goal we're trying to get to. They've now got all of the input of the staff and then the data to begin to build from. So they'll start to go through and figure out what is the solution going to be, right? Are we replacing on-premise infrastructure? So do we need to design a new server, or are we trying to move from on-prem to cloud, right? And they'll start to put together the introductory design of, this is the infrastructure requirements. This is the software requirements, right? So now they get into calling vendors and figuring out what is the vendor's requirements, right? What is your current supported operating system and system requirements in order for your software to run optimally? And they're getting the input of all the vendors of how those things should be implemented. And then ultimately, they're taking the answers from the questionnaires that we've provided and making sure that this option they're going is checking all of the main boxes, right? So the engineers will put together a preliminary design. They'll then begin to write out a detailed scope of work, kind of highlighting how the implementation is going to look. And from there, then they'll schedule a meeting with myself and also our account manager who represents the clients, right? So that's an opportunity then. So they'll go and they're presenting the design to us like we're the company that's about to get the project. So my role and the account manager's role in that then is almost as the client advocate, right? We're challenging that design. We're trying to find any gaps. We're making sure that the solution they're bringing forward is representative of what the client's expectations are, and then also what our company's expectations are in terms of just standards met. So that's kind of like the second step, and from there, a lot of times, it'll go back to redesign, right? And if we've come at a point where there's a disagreement, we're ultimately ironing out what route we're going to go, and a lot of times we'll go back and redesign. But the key is we keep doing this process of re-challenging the design until everybody in the room is in agreement of that this is the solution moving forward. So I think it's important for you to understand, because during this time, most of our clients are they don't know all of this back and forth all the time that's going into this, right? I think if you're a company with your internal IT, you should very much have a very similar approach, right? I think that the IT department should be treating it much the same. They should present this design to your leadership team, and then your leadership team you should be able to understand what it is they're proposing and challenge it and make sure that it does fit your 5-year plan, right? So that's kind of how the design process works from us. And then once we get to the point where all thumbs are up, then it's handed off for the account manager to present to the client.
Yeah, and one point I wanted to touch on that you brought up was when you reach out to get like the specs or the requirements for a particular piece of software or anything like that, generally you're going to get 2 sets. You're going to get your recommended specs and you're going to get your minimum supported specs. You never want to go off the minimum supported. You always want to work off the recommended, and you always want to go a little bit over that too, because remember, you're trying to plan this for a 5-year outlook. So those specs are most likely going to grow as updates come out, as the software changes. So the worst thing is, you make this large investment, you put in this new infrastructure, and then 2 years from now, a new software update comes out, and now you have to buy all new equipment because it no longer reaches those specs. Sometimes there's nothing you can do about that, but for the most part, if you take those recommended specs, go a little bit over, you're not going crazy. It's not like you're doubling them, but
yeah,
you go a little bit over, you're generally going to be able to get that 5-year outlook out of it. But it's, I don't even know why they give the minimum specs, because nobody should work off of those, because that's going to be the absolute lowest performing setup that you could have for that particular piece of software, which nobody wants. So
Yeah. There's no
you
fault
always want
tolerance
to work
built
off
into
of
minimum
that.
specs. There's no
Right.
fault tolerance. You're hoping for optimal conditions 24/7, and we all know when it comes to technology, that's just not the case. It's not realistic. So that's a great point. And here's the thing: is when you're when you're talking about cloud, you actually get a little more flexibility on that, right? Because it's very easy to scale resources on the fly. You just pay as you go. But when
Right.
you're investing in your own infrastructure, your best bet to get that overhead built in is when you purchase the server and you get that implemented. If you're trying to, if you go too light on the memory, you go to minimum specs up front, or you go, exactly what you need on a hard drive. Down the line, if you ever need to make an increase to that, it becomes much more it's very expensive, as opposed to if you just accommodated for that up front. Because, for example, with memory, in order to upgrade, depending on the current amount you're at, you may have to purchase all new memory sticks because they all have to match. There's a certain order that they need to be installed in. And without getting too specifics into the nerd stuff, it's you could be talking about potentially rebuying the total memory you need from scratch. And we've seen that happen. And that's a huge expense. And then also for the hard drives, storage is generally pretty cheap nowadays. Unless you're really getting into the high performance solid state drives. But when it comes to storage, that's not a huge cost. So you're better off going well over what you anticipate and having room to grow into that over time. And
because really once that's rated, right, it's going to be a lot more difficult now to add storage. You can do it,
but you got to blow everything out.
Right.
You're talking about a disaster recovery scenario, essentially. You're talking about backing up your servers, blowing out all the data, adding in the new drives, rebuilding that RAID, restoring your servers. So unless you're the type of company that you can have, that type of fault tolerance of having a couple days downtime potentially, depending on how much data you're talking about restoring, it's never in your best interest to do it that way. So I think it's just, you're always better going well above what you think you need.
Yeah, I agree. And it's just one of the things that, when you think about that 5-year outlook, I think a lot of people, specifically in IT, don't always think about that. But you really need to consider that 5-year business plan in this type of a design. You got to look at, what are the storage requirements going to be over the next 5 years? What are the processing requirements going to be over the next 5 years? How many employees are going to be added or subtracted over the next 5 years? Like, that's all the type of stuff that you really need to think about. That's why you got to do more than just look at this from a technical standpoint. You got to look at it from the business level, and what are the business's goals over the next 5 years? And that's got to play into this design to be able to make sure that when you ultimately put together this, and whether you're going to your client with a proposal or you're going to the leadership team and saying, here's what I need approval for. If you say it's going to be a 5-year plan, you want it to be a 5-year plan. So you really have to think through from a business level what that 5-year impact is going to look like. And then from there, you kind of design everything around that.
Yeah. So I think, so to kind of round out from there, you've got your design. I think the next key piece just to focus on is to have a very thorough, detailed scope of work. And I think this is important, especially if it's, your internal IT department, right? I think that's still the same case. You should ask for a detailed scope of work, because when it's all said and done, you get through all of the detailed migrations and such. You want to be able to go back and look at something and essentially have a checklist to validate, the expenditure that you put forward to make this initiative happen, that it was completed as originally planned and designed. And I think that's obviously important then when you're working with a company, an outsourced IT company such as ourselves, because you want to validate that everything you thought up and imagined it did come to fruition, and that they did deliver on their end of the deal. So the piece I want to point out on the scope of work is the scope of work should be written in a way that is thorough, very specific in terms of what the objectives are, but it should be written in a way that you as the client understands, right? Whatever role you're in, you're typically relying on either your internal IT staff to understand the technology or your partner that's helping you supplement. So I think it's very important for it to not be written in a sense where it's so far over your head and so technically detailed that you don't understand what it is they're presenting. So I think it's important for the scope of work to be written in a way where it's specific of what's being done, but that you can understand it and follow through. Because I think that validation process at the project completion is important, so that both sides of the table feel like what was agreed upon was met.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, you got to have a change control process for any project. But really, when you talk about a properly assessed, designed, and scoped project, there really should be very little in the way of change. The only change really should be if the requirement changes for some reason. If you're halfway through the project and then somebody goes, oh, you know what, it'd be really cool if we also had this. Like, that really should be the only changes. It should never be, oh, well, we didn't think about that, or oh, we didn't realize that. That type of stuff should not be a change on a project, because that means that it wasn't properly assessed, designed, and scoped out. So I think that's another way to measure kind of the success of the project is, what changes did we have? Did we have any, first of all? And then if we did, were they a result of something being missed, or were they as a result of somebody adding something, midway through the process?
Yeah, that's a great point, and the change control, and that's why it's so important that the most important phases of the project is that planning phase. That sets the tone for everything, right? That's where expectations are laid out. That's where, the design is validated, and that's your opportunity to get it right. So I think, you should never have a very strict timeline. If you're going to be flexible on a project, it should be during the planning phases. And I think there's no such thing as putting too much time into it up front, because that's what allows you to, when you get to the point of the implementation, that's where the disruptions happen. That's where the potential for risk and negative impact can happen. And if you rush through that planning phase, you can plan on all of that happening during the migration phase. So I think it's just key. And the more time we spend on planning, the better projects we have, the better outcome where everybody's happy, right? I mean, we're trying to take the angle of how can we have this business have zero downtime during their working hours, right? And that's how we're kind of scoping it and planning it around. And when we're taking our time to identify all potential risk and stuff up front, it's you usually end up with a project that you don't have to have a change control in. We have a process there if we do need to use it. And on occasion, like you said, things change. You get in the middle of a project and, you're moving folders and you see maybe an opportunity where, hey, this doesn't seem like the best folder structure for what you guys have. Before we just move things from A to B, do you want to take the opportunity to go and reorganize your folder structure, right? Do you want to archive out these old clients you haven't touched in years? And, so I think those kind of things come up during projects, and that's okay. I think, those are some of the stuff where, you're going to have those kind of things. And if you see an opportunity, don't be afraid to do that. But again, it's just the planning is just the most important piece.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we talked about a couple of questions going into this, how to handle it for an internal team, but what you should expect out of an outsourced team as well. And I think we kind of have answered that throughout the talk here is, there's going to be times where you want to do something and your internal team doesn't have the expertise. If your internal team has been working on on-premise Windows servers for the past 10 years and they've never touched Azure, and you have this initiative to go to Azure, you're probably going to want to bring in an outside resource. Or if you're moving from whatever email system you have today over to Office 365 and you've never seen Office 365, it's probably time to reach out to an external IT partner. So there are going to be times where you're going to want help on a project, even if you have an internal IT team there. But really what you should expect out of that external partner is really everything that we've talked about. All of the processes that we've talked about that we do internally, that you should expect your internal team to do, that's what you should expect to see from your outside partner as well. I get calls sometimes and somebody will say, hey, you know what, we're a 50-user company, we want to go to Office 365, how much is that going to cost? And they don't always like my answer of, okay, well, we have to start with an assessment. I can't give you a price because I'm sure they're calling other companies and they're being given a price over the phone, but that's a sign that you're talking to a company who's not properly planning. If they're just throwing a price at you, they're either over quoting it to cover themselves, or they're underquoting it to try to get the business, knowing that they're going to hit you with a bunch of changes once it gets going. So I think that's the first and foremost thing you should look for when you're talking to an outside partner is, if you ask them for a price over the phone and they give you a solid price over the phone, run away, because they're not doing things properly. If they might be able to give you an estimate, some kind of a range to work within. Generally based on our experience, I can tell somebody it's probably going to be between these couple of numbers, and we're usually pretty close. But anybody that's going to do this properly has to start with that assessment and really follow through that whole process.
Yeah, and I think too, a point to that is if somebody's giving you a flat, they're giving you the upfront cost of a project, then you can almost guarantee that they're going to eliminate that whole pre-assessment phase of interviewing your leadership team, your departments, getting an understanding of your growth, wanting to know what you guys are looking to address during the process. They're basically telling you, we have a solution that's cookie cutter that we plug you into, and this is your cost. That's what that means when you get a cost up front. And, that's, some companies might be fine with that, but, typically our clients, I think what works well for us is we have a relationship where every time we go into a new project, we're starting from scratch. This company has specific needs, requirements, and we're going to tailor a solution, customize a solution to meet those for this specific client. One project is, we can do 10 different email migrations, in a 2-month period, and there's going to be a lot of uniqueness between those 10 email migrations. It's just, I think that's only fair to the client, and I think that's how we like to deliver the support. And
I think it's important to know too. I mean, we've got clients that we've worked with for 20 plus years. If they were to call tomorrow and need a new project, or if we were to come to them based on refresh schedule or whatever, and say, hey, it's time to look at this. Even though we've worked with them for the past 20 years and we know their environment inside and out, and we probably already know what their 5-year objectives are because we've got a roadmap, even though we already know all of that, we're still going to go through this exact same process. We're not going to cut any time out of it. We're not going to cut any steps out of it. You still, every single time a change is going to be made, you start with the assessment. And again, so that's, I think a lot of internal teams, they go, well, you know what, I've been working on this system for 10 years. I built it, so I know it inside and out. So there's no point in doing that because I know it. But, we've got clients that we've done their past 4 refreshes. We're still going to start the 5th refresh or the move to the cloud or whatever it is with this assessment process and walk through all of the same thing. It's going to take all of the same amount of time as if they were a brand new client, because it's the only way to be 100% sure that when you put together that scope of work and that design, that it's what actually is going to be what they need.
Yeah, I think that's the key, man. It's just everything has to start with an assessment, and it's easy. You're right. Sometimes you already know what the solution should be, right? And we pump the brakes. We have a process. We have a full template that we follow, a checklist that we go through, and I think that just you gotta do your due diligence every time, no matter what you think there's almost inevitably something you're overlooking or missing, or there's opportunity to address something else at the same time. So
right. Yeah. So I think hopefully you got something out of today, especially if you do have some kind of an initiative coming out, whether you got your internal team that's going to handle it, or you're looking to work with an outsourced IT provider. And regardless of if you're looking to work with us or not, these are just some pointers that you can take and that you should be looking for with whoever you're working for on a project. You need to know that they're going to properly plan things out. They're going to properly do that assessment phase, look at your business goals and your business outlook, so that when all is said and done, you're happy and you've made the proper investment. So I think that's some good pointers to keep in mind, and we appreciate you spending some more time with us this week, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Interact with Tech Talk Detroit at techtalkdetroit.com or on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.